This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and thank you to all of you. Particular thanks to Heythrop for doing me the honour of inviting me to come and speak on this very auspicious occasion. It's a matter of real regret to me that I've not been able to attend more of this celebration. And it always feels a little odd to be coming in to conclude something whose beginnings you haven't witnessed. So the equal and opposite dangers of saying what has been said by everybody and saying something in contradiction to what has been said by everybody are very much in my mind as I stand to speak this evening. But what I wish to offer is a few very basic reflections on 3 or 4 fundamental and distinctive elements in the Jesuit approach to education from the very beginning. Because, of course, an approach to education has been an intrinsic part of the Jesuit identity from the start. The constitutions of the society make it abundantly clear that education is taken for granted as something that everyone is involved in, one way and another. Not only through the provision of education for others, but also in the notion of a sustained educative process in which the brothers of the society themselves are involved. But the first aspect which strikes me, reading the constitutions, is how education for the non-Jesuit is seen as a very simple and a very natural extension of the process of formation. An extension of the process of formation. So the life of the community itself, which shapes brothers in a certain way, for a certain end, is what remains at the heart and at the foundation of any enterprise that goes beyond the life of the society as such. As editors and translators have pointed out, the word scholaris is used in constitutions both for Jesuit scholastics and for students in general. And the translation in the classics of Western spirituality clearly feels the need to make some distinctions in the translation, which are helpful, rather obscure the fact that there is something of a real continuity being taken for granted, which is lost if you use 2 different words. And so there's the first principle, which I think is worth reflecting on. Education, and not least university education, is the extension of a process of formation in community. It naturally spills over from that process of learning to be in the community. But it's that basic principle which I think makes sense of a second fundamental element in the Jesuit approach from the start. There is a great deal of emphasis from those early days on the provision of education without expense, or with minimal expense, to those externs being educated. When colleges are set up, as Ignatius himself says in his letter to Antonio de Arroz, parents are relieved of the expense of having teachers to instruct their children in letters and virtue, and fulfill their duty in conscience regarding their children's formation. Persons who would have difficulty finding, even for pay, teachers to whom they could entrust their children will find them in these colleges with complete security. The provision of education is not, we might say, a commodity, but a ministry. Not a commodity, but a ministry. Hence, to regard it as a profit-making enterprise cannot be anywhere near the heart of what it's about. It's not even a contracted service. It is part of the evangelical mission of the community to extend its own reflection and its own development freely, without charge, to others. And a third fundamental element, not perhaps so theologically basic as what we've just been talking about, is a keen sense of the need to balance a set of universal standards and goals with an awareness of local priorities as affecting the detail of practice. Ignatius himself observes, it may seem obvious, but it still needs saying, that what you eat, what you wear, and when you get up are going to look rather different in different climates and environments. The timetable of a day, even the way in which you structure a particular course of study, is going to depend on quite a lot of factors which are local and not universal and uniform. So that in addition to being a ministry, a process of formation, it's a process of formation grounded in a constant recovery of deep attention to the particulars of a social and temporal situation. Formation, ministry, attention. Those, I would argue, are three abidingly significant principles in St. Ignatius's vision. I won't say philosophy of education. Why not philosophy of education? Because I don't think he has a philosophy of education. I think he has a theology of educating, and that's a little different. And perhaps that difference may become clear in the rest of what I have to say. Now let's go back for a moment to that first principle about formation. This rests on an assumption that the ultimate point of education is that we should be able to live as God purposes us to live. That we realize our ultimate end. Education is either about becoming what we are finally meant to be, or it's about nothing. And that theological principle resonates throughout the constitutions and throughout Ignatius's letters on the subject. Our formation is a formation in humanity, three-dimensional humanity which God has created in God's own image. And that, of course, means that whatever happens within the educational community is material to the ultimate end. For example, relations between teacher and student, the character of those relations are not accidental. Getting that right is an intrinsic part of educating, because what's in view is formation in community towards the ultimate human end, which is life in justice and love in community. Hence Ignatius's attention to the way in which teachers and older brethren take responsibility for the spiritual maturity and discipline of others, not just in order to keep order, but because that is part of an intrinsic, integral picture of how the community grows and what it's for. That idea that relations between teacher and taught are intrinsic to the educational process is one which needs underlining, because it hasn't always been taken for granted. And I was struck to hear the Vice-Chancellor mentioning just now how significant it is that Heythrop maintains that tradition of close personal relation between teacher and taught, not as, what should we call it, a kind of softening or humanizing element, a selling point, but as part of what it is to educate. And that, of course, leads me to suspect that the Jesuit Institution, as envisaged by Ignatius and the first generation of Jesuit educators, is always going to be a school of the Lord's service, very much like Benedict's monastery, which was described in the rule in exactly those terms. A school of the Lord's service because it is the nature of mutual relationships which does the real educating and the real forming. So the Jesuit Educational Institution is one in which shared responsibility, shared involvement in growth in humanity towards God's purposes for humanity are at the centre of what is envisaged. But we can go a little bit further than that and pick up what is, by common consent, a very significant and perhaps slightly unexpected feature of what Ignatius and others have to say about education. The whole approach of the constitutions and the letters takes it for granted that all kinds of study are part, ultimately, of what will fulfill your ultimate end. In other words, being a good engineer, lawyer, or linguist can be part of fulfilling the image of God in you. It's not just a natural skill which is neither here nor there. It's part of exercising that dimension of the image of God which has to do with your intellect, your capacity to see clearly, to reason, to plan, to hope intelligently. And Ignatius is clear that both humane letters and the natural sciences are part of that. Studying these subjects with attention, with excellence, with focus and concentration is not an end in itself, but doing these things well is intrinsic to laying the ground for theology. And that, of course, cuts in two ways. On the one hand, all these rather diverse areas of human intellectual excellence are believed to have something to do with growth into an adult, intelligent apprehension of and participation in the divine life, theology in its fullest sense. On the other hand, theology is shown to be involved inextricably with intellectual excellence. Theology cannot cut itself off from the whole process of human intellectual inquiry. The worst thing we can possibly do for either the academic disciplines or, in general, theology in particular, would be to drive a wedge between these things and say they have nothing to do with each other. So we find in the constitutions, 450, since the arts or natural sciences dispose of the intellectual powers of theology and are useful for the perfect understanding and use of it, and also by their own nature help toward the same ends, they should be treated with fitting diligence. Once again, with attention, we might say. The arts and the natural sciences give some exercise, not just five-finger exercise either, to the mind which is beginning to open itself up to theology. And in some sense, the very subject matter of humane letters and the sciences has to do with laying the groundwork for theology. So to put it in very simple terms, thinking theologically is not some isolated, sanitized, protected form of thinking. It's thinking. Good thinking. And how do you learn good thinking? By good teaching about a whole variety of things. And there is, Ignatius seems to imply, there is something about good thinking which, like it or not, sooner or later leaves the door open into theology. Has to do with living out what God expects of God's human creatures. So excellence in these various intellectual disciplines is not going to be an end in itself, but a ground for theology. Doing all these things superlatively well, with as much attention and diligence as humanly possible, becomes part of preparing the possibility of theology, which in turn, of course, for Ignatius, is to do with preparing the ground for mission. So the task of the teacher in the Jesuit institution is twofold. As we've seen, it involves the nurture of common spiritual life. But it also involves the kind of instruction that leaves open paths to the theological future. That's quite a challenge. It certainly doesn't mean bolting on some theological extras to every single course. It doesn't mean trying to be pious while you're doing your chemistry. Ignatius, I think, would have said on the basis of some of his related remarks that being pious while you're doing your chemistry is one way of not doing good chemistry. And the proper way of exercising your piety is to be a good chemist. No, it's not about an extra dimension, it's not about edifying remarks around the edges. But it's about penetrating to that level of depth, complexity and excitement in your intellectual activity, which, whether you fully realize it or not, is disposing your mind to theology. Understand something about how extraordinary the intellectual life is, and you never know what might surprise you as raw material for the intellectual life. The contemporary atheist or agnostic scientist from central casting might well feel that that was a little unexpected, but I don't think that Ignatius would have felt disposed to apologize at all. He would be perfectly prepared to say, the more your mind is accustomed to that richness and complexity which intellectual life delivers, the more you are, know it or not, like it or not, being disposed to something larger than simply that discipline. So there's the double task of the teacher: nurture, formation, but also teaching at the kind of depth, the kind of animating complexity which will so excite the vision of what human mental life and spiritual and imaginative life are about, that something begins to open up that is more than just any one of the disciplines that are addressed in the education program. And to put it like that, I think does allow us to say that even in a dramatically different environment in the 21st century, some of these principles are still readily understandable. Any institution these days, whether it calls itself Christian or not, Jesuit or not, is going to be unimaginably more diverse than any group that Ignatius could have imagined. And yet, that dual task of the teacher, formation in community, formation in responsibility, that commitment to open-ended and deep intellectual endeavor, this remains, I would say, a vision and an ideal that is not in the least dated. We might pick up a remark that Ignatius makes in that same letter to Arav, which I quoted earlier, where he speaks of how the foundation of a Jesuit college will provide lots of candidates for important public jobs. From among those who at present are merely students, in time, some will emerge to play diverse roles: to preach and carry on the care of souls, to the government of the land and the administration of justice, others to other responsible occupations. The children of today become the adults of tomorrow, and their good formation in life and learning will benefit many others. The implication of that, which I think is one well worth pausing on, is that a future in public life of some kind, teaching, government, law, or whatever, actually requires these foundations of intellectual depth. It is not a disadvantage to a judge, a teacher, or a politician to have an intellectual hinterland. On the contrary, it is a massive disadvantage, a corrupting disadvantage, not to have an intellectual hinterland. We may draw the moral wherever we wish, but the point is that for these public ministries and public services, Ignatius assumes that it's good to be able to think. Ultimately, that means that the lawyer, the politician, the teacher, and those who exercise other responsible positions have to have some element in their work, some element in their awareness relating to that last end, that final horizon of what it is like to be human in the presence and purpose of God. That no one can do, ultimately, a satisfactory job as teacher, politician, or lawyer without some awareness of what human beings are for. This cluster of ideas, which seems to be very deeply grounded in that particular remark of Ignatius, that's one of the most substantial challenges which the Ignatian vision puts to both education and politics today. It's intriguing that in recent years we've seen more and more books about our social crises and international tangles, rather wistfully saying that what we haven't got is a credible and coherent doctrine of what's good for human beings as such. And that without that, we'll constantly be condemned to a kind of hamster wheel-like circularity of short-term problem solving without any robust awareness of what a good human life looks like. And that's put perhaps most clearly in that excellent book by Robert and Edward Skidelsky, How Much Is Enough, which attempts to retrieve the Aristotelian sense of the good life as key to understanding the financial and social crises we currently face. In short, the active and responsible citizen, perhaps most visible in law or government or teaching, but far more widely spread, the active or responsible citizen needs a vision of what humanity is for, and if that vision is somewhere in the background, then the connection between intellectual life and social and political engagement and faith becomes a lot easier to hold. When that connection fractures, it's not entirely surprising if various kinds of nonsense come to prevail in church and society alike, not to mention the academy. The phrase I used earlier was that education in Ignatius's purview is not a commodity, not even a contract. It is the overflow, the extension of the process of formation. The Ignatian College is, before anything else, a cell of the body of Christ. And like all cells of the body of Christ, it educates and enlarges by participation, not just by instruction at a distance. You can't really do Ignatian education online. Good servants but bad masters, these techniques. Education by participation. And, as I've said already, that doesn't mean that the university or the college, as a cell of the body of Christ, is a place of ubiquitous and obtrusive piety. Ignatius is nothing if not realistic about the limited time for devotional exercises that belongs to the life of the student. I should perhaps add that what he thinks is a limited time for devotional exercises would for most of us look quite generous. But the point he's making is that, as I said earlier, the theological or spiritual dimension is not an extra or a competitor. Doing the intellectual work properly is intrinsic to the devotional life. Concentrate on what you now have to do, that is, study or teach. But you're doing so within the framework of an intentional community whose entire vision, whose global vision, as you might say, is bound up with the quality of the common life in which you are learning to be a human being with your ultimate end in view. It was not a Jesuit, but a Benedictine headmaster who famously said in response to a question in the mid-20th century about the purpose of his school that he intended to teach his boys to die. That's perhaps putting it rather more starkly than some of the early Jesuit material does. Yet there is something in that which is worth saying. The community's intention is to create the likeness of Christ. It's to create sacrificial service. It is to explode and remove from the scene all models of commodification and contract, the process of sharing the human good that is education. And that, I think, is a crucial point in what this tradition has to say to us at the moment. What this entire model of education proposes is something which requires us to resist diverse sorts of narrowing of the educational enterprise. A narrowing which doesn't allow us to think of what is humanly good. A narrowing which doesn't allow us to think of the depth at which the intellect becomes excited. A narrowing which removes educational process from the creative interaction, the rub, the friction, the necessary friction, if you like, of human interaction. And it's all too easy in a short-term, financially anxious social climate to assume that the basic truth about education lies closer to that than to the Ignatian model. So, appropriating and making contemporary this Ignatian picture is something which I believe potentially has enormous critical edge in the kind of society we now live in. It has to do really with what we think the intellectual life is. How seriously we think of ourselves, of our own humanity, as an intellectual enterprise. The word intellectual terrifies a lot of people, or it provokes perhaps their mockery. Paul Johnson some years ago wrote a book called Intellectuals, which was mostly about the misbehavior in bedrooms of famous and clever people. We need to do a little bit better than that. The intellect, the human capacity to absorb the other intelligently in one's own identity and be absorbed in the other, that process, that emptying and filling, which is part, historically, of how theologians have seen the life of intellect, that is simply an aspect of our humanity. Not a luxury, not an eccentricity. And if we take seriously this kind of vision, part of the task we take away from a celebration like this is the task of rehabilitating the intellectual. And Ignatius encourages us to do this, because he says the more excited you get about the life of your mind, the more open that life of the mind is likely to be to its maker. And that means that whatever else is said about intellectual and academic study, it's not trivial, it's not marginal to the enterprise of spiritual maturation and discipleship. And of course, to go back to another very basic principle here, this is not, in Ignatius's mind, something for a few clerical specialists. The very notion of the life of a Jesuit college, as it were, overflowing to draw others in, external students, lay and clerical, reminds us that part of the vision that permeates Ignatius's writings is of an educated and well-equipped laity. He has some very interesting things to say in his letter to Pelletier about how much it matters that lay people are able to give a reason for their faith, able to argue effectively with skeptics, heretics, enemies of the faith. The use of the intellect is intrinsic, again, to faithfulness, to effective following of Christ. And an educated laity is essential for the well-being of the Church. One can perhaps overdo the novelty of this as a principle in the 16th century. There had been educated laity for a millennium and a half in the Christian Church. In the Eastern Christian world, of course, there had never been the kind of break there was in the West in the preparation of educated professional lay people in public office. But what Ignatius does is to put this firmly and explicitly at the foundation of his philosophy or his theology of educating. Christian people need to be stretched. They need to be excited and engaged about their thinking capacity, and that is for the good of the Church and the good of the society they serve. For the good of the Church, because it means that people will not dumbly fail to respond to the challenges to faith that will arise. Good for the society they serve, because providing that intellectual hinterland which I mentioned earlier on. So these reflections are designed to try and draw out just a little bit how the Ignatian vision of education, not least of university education, has its roots in wrestling with a basic theological question. How do we live in the light of our ultimate end? How do we become more deeply human in the ways God wants us to be and has made us capable of being? How do we join up also the different bits of our mental, spiritual, imaginative lives? How do we see the excitement and the fulfillment of all these areas of our humanity feeding in to the great stream of theological encounter with God? Ignatius believed that every aspect of the ministry of the Society of Jesus had to do, sooner or later, with realizing the image of God in human beings. And that perhaps is what holds together every single policy, every single initiative of the society that he founded. What is fresh and challenging from our perspective is to see how that plays itself out in thinking about the life of the mind, the discipleship of the mind, in a way which opens up critical questions for church and society, which allows us to rethink what it is that we need in public figures and responsible citizens, which allows us to see that what I called earlier the hinterland for such persons is of crucial importance for everybody's well-being. How do we vivify all this with the same scope of critical challenge for society today? The anniversary that we've been celebrating in the life of Heythrop College reminds us that this particular vision of education has been around for quite a long time, has been served and embodied faithfully, creatively in Heythrop by any number of hugely distinguished scholars, thinkers, theologians, writers. We know, in other words, that this can be done, that it has what we're now encouraged to call sustainability built into it. We know that, very much in accord with my third initial principle, it's an institution capable of flexibility, rethinking itself, enlarging itself, in exactly the ways that Ignatius wanted to see in diverse contexts. And in Heythrop's most recent developments, we've seen abundantly how the notion of an overflow of formation has lain behind so many new styles, new possibilities of learning. Heythrop remains deeply committed to an educated laity for the sake of the well-being of the Church. And I would add in brackets, as I might well do, the churches. Heythrop remains deeply committed, therefore, to the notion that in enlarging the capacity of lay people, you enlarge the well-being of the society you're in. It's taken for granted, what I think Ignatius takes for granted, that the laity are not passive partners in the work of the body of Christ, nor simply are they consumers of a theology cooked in somewhat remote kitchens by specialists who don't otherwise talk to them. If institutions of theological education and general education are able to go on paying that kind of deep attention to the quality of relationship, the quality of the interaction between disciplines and between persons, then I think that the anniversary we celebrate today represents some very good news for the Church and the society we're in. I believe that those who have joined together to affirm that celebration in these last couple of days believe that is indeed what Heythrop has done and is doing, and by the grace of God will do. And in conclusion, it does mean that our challenge is to become constantly, repeatedly, a learning church. A church which is committed always to being questioned, not just questioning, but being questioned by that which calls it into being. And if we are a learning church, perhaps we may make a different kind of contribution to being a learning society. That is, a society constantly open to being questioned, not confident that the fashion of the day is the right answer, growing together in understanding of that humanity which, if it is indeed in the image of the invisible God, is as properly inexhaustible and exhilarating as God himself. That's the theological vision which Heythrop is animated by